Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is war correspondent and author of The Dictator's Wife, Hollie McKay. Hollie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Over the past weekend, the president of Iran was killed in a helicopter crash. Before we get into really who he was, can I get your reaction to the news?
Well, it was quite shocking. I think anytime a head of state dies very suddenly in an accident like that, it's certainly very, very shocking. And I think that whilst I don't think anything huge is going to change in Iran because it really is the Ayatollah who pulls the strings, it certainly gives a moment of pause and questions as to what may happen next.
So before we get into what happens next, I would like you to take us back to a few decades ago to the 1970s. Who was Raisi and how did he rise the ranks to eventually become president?
Yeah, well, this he was a very prolific figure, and he got the nickname of the Butcher of Iran for many different reasons, which I'll get into in a moment. So he started as a cleric. He started just studying the Islamic texts at the age of 15, and by the age of 19, was already in a very high-ranking judicial position. Remember, in Iran, unlike the United States, where we go to law school and that's how we sort of work our way up in the courts, in Iran, being Sharia society, it's based on your knowledge of Islam. And so he was very much a scholar of that, and that's how he ended up in the judicial system. And when he was in his 20s, he was one of four people that belonged to what they called the death committees. So after the revolution in the 1980s, when the Ayatollah took over Iran, thousands upon thousands of opposition members were swept up and they were referred to as terrorists. And many suffered immense torture, and somewhere with sort of up the figure of 30,000, if not more, people were executed. And this was under Raisi's watch. And this is how he got that very notorious nickname. After that, he sort of continued to grow in the ranks, becoming an attorney general. And then eventually in 2016, he was the chief prosecutor in Iran, which meant that he was overseeing many of the executions, many of the sentences, and then became president in 2021. And in his first 2 years alone, more than 500 people were executed in Iran. So it really shows that this was his approach to handling opposition. And we've seen with the protests that have happened in the last couple of years how many people have been sort of thrown into the gallows and suffered the worst of the worst because of that. And at the end of the day, that buck stops with Raisi.
You mentioned that his nickname was the Butcher. That's really a grim, sinister, graphic nickname. And I want to read a passage from your recent piece. You wrote this. You wrote about what he stood for: perpetrating some of the worst human rights abuses I've ever documented. It is the stuff of wild nightmares. And you talked about people who saw him while they were being tortured, who were tortured under his rule. Can you talk about their stories a little bit?
Absolutely. So over the last couple of years, I've been documenting different stories, and in particular of Iranians who were in prison in the 1980s, many of them because they were opposition figures, in particular belonging to a very controversial organization known as the MEK, which its goal is to essentially overthrow the Iranian regime. But they are referred to as terrorists by Tehran. But the sort of level of torture and suffering that many of these people went through in the 1980s, it was some of the worst things I've ever heard. And I remember going home and just absolutely having nightmares. We're talking about women who were 8 months pregnant that were being stomped on. We're talking about people that were being hung, were being executed, were being put in all sorts of horrible positions for days and days on end, people that were forced to watch their loved ones be executed and be hung. The degree to which what humans can do to other humans, really, I'd never heard anything more terrific. In one situation, there was a man that he was forced to eat his own eyebrows. Just really depraved things that you can't even imagine how people could come up with that. And this was all under Raisi's watch.
From your accounts, I mean, it was harrowing. You couldn't, like you said, you can't even think of how people come up with that type of torture. You also described him, or he was described as one of the architects of the kangaroo courts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, again, when he was part of this four-person committee sentencing people, and they may go and sort of stand before Raisi and three other judicial figures, they weren't really given a proper hearing the way that we know that in the United States. The decisions were essentially already made. They were often forced to confess things that they didn't do, and were essentially dealt these capital punishments without seeing a lawyer, without any real sense of justice. And unfortunately, we still see those kangaroo courts existing in Iran today.
The State Department released a statement on his death, and it read in part this: the United States expresses its official condolences for his death. What do you make of that, knowing about he was nicknamed the Butcher, he oversaw death and torture. How do you square that away with the State Department's statement?
I think the State Department there is State Department is diplomacy, and it's released a very diplomatic statement in response to his death. But whilst we never want to celebrate the death of anybody, it's hard to find kind of a worse leader than Raisi was, and I'm sure that the State Department and officials know that. But they also have to play that diplomatic game, and that's what the State Department does best.
And looking back, what do you think his legacy is going to be for Iran and for its people?
I think that's very individual. I've seen footage today of lots and lots of people that are out to see his funeral, and I'm sure Iran has many hardline figures, and I'm sure there are many people who will genuinely mourn his death. And I think that there will probably be more people, particularly the younger generations in Iran, the people that we've seen over the last couple of years protesting the hijab mandate, which of course Raisi put in place as well. I think that quite secretly, I'm sure they're not too upset about his demise. But having said that, it's really going to be someone else in his place. We're going to see elections within the next 50 days, and don't expect them to be fair and free elections. Anytime Iran has an election, the only people that are on the ballot are people that are previously approved by the Ayatollah. And Raisi was sort of very much a protege of the Ayatollah. And so whoever comes in next will be some degree of a hardline. They may not be as hardline as Raisi was, but they will certainly be in lockstep with the Ayatollah, which is sadly why I don't see a huge difference coming to Iran.
I know you said the Ayatollah pulls the string, but the buck stopped with Raisi. In a post-Raisi Iran, you're thinking that it's going to be more of the same?
Unfortunately, I do see that. I don't see people who are genuinely sort of against a lot of what is happening in Iran and the repression. They're nowhere near the ballots. Most of those people, they can try as hard as they can to get there, and they will end up in jail. The Ayatollah is not going to allow them a platform to run. So it's very much, sadly, it's sort of more of the same. And that's essentially what we have seen in Iran really since 1979.
And you've gotten firsthand accounts of people who were tortured at the hands of Raisi. Do you think anything's missing from the international conversation since Sunday, since news of his death broke?
I think what is often swept under the rug is the degree to his role in torture. And I think a lot of what's happened in Iran, and particularly in the 1980s, which was an incredibly dark period for many, I think a lot of that really hasn't been acknowledged to the full degree. I think there's many interests at play in protecting certain groups, and I think that regardless of the circumstances or regardless of the nature of why people are in prison, there is never an excuse for that kind of torture. And I think that always needs to be recognized. And I think we could do more about bringing awareness to Iran's past. And the fact that what is happening today in Evin prison and other places isn't anything new. This has been going on a long time. And it's hard for the international community to interfere to stop it. But it's also just a very harrowing concept to think what's happening day in and day out for so long, and that we are so powerless to really do anything about these human rights abuses.
One of the most harrowing accounts from your piece was someone saying that they were getting tortured. I believe the woman was 9 months pregnant, and she noticed someone looking especially happy watching her being tortured, and that was Raisi. Hollie McKay, I really appreciate you coming on here. You are the author of The Dictator's Wife. Where can people find the book?
The book is going to be released in June. It's available for pre-order. It's available Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, wherever you find your books. The easiest place to find all those links is hollie.mckay/books.
Hollie McKay, thank you again.
Thank you.